minutitos más. Mientras esperamos, queremos explicarles un poquito con esta primera pantalla que vamos a tener una traducción simultánea. Eso quiere decir que podemos ver la presentación de Helen esta mañana en inglés o en español. Y si pueden seguir las instrucciones de la pantalla para ajustar su programa según quieran escuchar. Y si tienen dudas, por favor, mándenos un mensaje por chat para poderlas resolver. Y aquí tenemos quien pueda apoyarles. Vamos a tener una sesión de presentación por parte de Helen de 50 minutos y después tenemos 40 minutos para preguntas. Fernando nos va a apoyar con las preguntas. Queremos agradecer a María Fernanda, a Luis, a Marisa, a Fernando y a Flor por estarnos apoyando en este webinar. Y quiero darles un poco de introducción acerca del tema que vamos a estar charlando el día de hoy. Y para esto les comento que según datos publicados por la Organización Mundial de la Salud, cada año se producen 1.38 millones de nuevos casos y 458,000 muertes por cáncer de mama, siendo este padecimiento el más frecuente en las mujeres, tanto en los países desarrollados como en los países en desarrollo. Sin embargo, los conocimientos actuales sobre las causas de cáncer de mama son insuficientes, señala la OMS. Todos los factores de riesgo que son convencionalmente aceptados solo se relacionan con entre el 30 y el 50% de los casos, dejando del 50 al 70% sin causa conocida, pero que puede relacionarse con factores de riesgo no convencionalmente aceptados, como la exposición a sustancias perturbadoras endocrinas y carcinogénicas, entre otros. Y con esta introducción me da muchísimo gusto presentarles a Helen Lynn. Ella es maestra en salud y medio ambiente por la Universidad de Middle Essex del Reino Unido y actualmente pertenece al grupo de investigación en salud ocupacional y ambiental de la Universidad de Stirling en Escocia. Ella es fundadora de la Alliance for Cancer Prevention del Reino Unido y fundó la campaña From Pink to Prevention y el Lincolnshire Cancer Project. Ella es miembro del Comité Asesor Internacional de Mujeres en Europa por un Futuro Común desde hace 10 años. De 1995 al 2007 trabajó en el Women's Environmental Network del Reino Unido, misma que es una organización que sirve para empoderar, educar e informar a mujeres y hombres sobre los problemas ambientales que los afectan, especialmente a ellos y sus comunidades. Y sin más, quiero abrir el micrófono para escuchar a Helen. Estamos muy contentos de tenerla acá y poder traducir sus conocimientos y experiencias para pues los países de habla hispana. Y adelante, Helen, el micrófono es tuyo.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you to Casa and IPAN Latin America for organizing this webinar. So I'm just going to move my screen a bit. There, okay. Yeah, I will try to speak as slowly as possible. It's kind of hard for an Irish person, but if I do speed up, please let me know somehow. I've been working on the issue linking women, health and environment for the last 25 years. A lot of my work has been on the primary prevention of breast cancer. I have worked in Europe and internationally on the issue. I'm very honoured to be asked to speak about this today, because we all really like to speak about our work, but this work to me is really, really important, and I think it needs to be heard in every corner of the globe, really. So we know that breast cancer has strong links to environmental and occupational exposures, and it is a disease that kills women. Of course, anyone with breast tissue can get breast cancer. Men get breast cancer too, but in much smaller numbers than women. So for the purpose of this webinar, I am focusing on women's breast cancer, female breast cancer. And I think that COVID is shining a very harsh light on public health, which has been sidelined for years, and also the multiple inequalities which have contributed to decades of illness and disease. And while there is poverty and inequality and little action on primary prevention, then we cannot protect public health. And this applies also to the cancer epidemic. Now, in 2013, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in the UK published a report. It was a scientific impact paper on chemical exposures during pregnancy. And this paper was designed to inform women who are pregnant or breastfeeding about the sources and routes of toxic chemical exposure in order for them to take positive action to minimize harm to the fetus. And the report linked exposure to environmental chemicals in pregnancy with adverse birth outcomes, such as pregnancy loss, preterm birth, low birth weight, birth defects, obesity, early puberty, adult disease, and mortality. And also it linked to the impairment of fertility and fecundity in women and testicular development and reproductive function in males. And all these have been associated with female exposure to everyday chemicals that we may meet in the environment, in our workplace, or at home. And these chemicals can be found in plastics, in personal care products, and cleaning products. And these are chemicals like bisphenol A, which used to be found in baby feeding bottles. It's banned in Europe now. But it's also found in food wrapping and the lining of tin cans. And chemicals like phthalates, which are found in plastics and leach from plastics. Phthalates are found in carpets, fabrics, personal care products, fragrances, and glues. But there was a huge backlash to the RCOG, the Royal College report, because the report urged women to take a safety-first approach to minimising the risk in the presence of uncertainty. So they were advocating a precautionary principle, and questions were raised about the lack of evidence in inverted commas, and the report was called alarmist and controversial. But in 2015, the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics published a very similar paper, FIGO, an opinion on reproductive health impacts of exposure to toxic environmental chemicals. And they recommended that exposure to toxic environmental chemicals is a feature of everyday life across the planet, and it harms our capacity for healthy human reproduction. And environmental chemicals cross borders. There are no barriers. They cross borders through trade, through food, through wind, water, and they can also cross the placenta. And there are inequalities and injustices in how toxic chemicals move around the world. So a global perspective is needed to ensure equity and health for all. FIGO also said that the burden of proof should be shifted to the manufacturers and legislators to regulate these chemicals, but also that preventing exposure to environmental chemicals is a priority for reproductive health professionals everywhere. And the difference between these papers was the Royal College one placed the onus for ensuring the safety of the fetus on the mother, whereas FIGO called on legislators and manufacturers to ensure safety. And the main chemicals that both RCOG and FIGO were concerned about were environmentally endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs. These chemicals have the ability to interfere with our hormones, which are the body's message carriers, and the endocrine system, which is the body's messenger system, which controls every aspect of life. And chemicals that can interfere with this system have devastating consequences. And endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs, adversely affect reproduction, development, including development of the brain. They affect fertility. They are linked to cancers, obesity, and asthma and allergies. And we know from looking at endocrine disruptors that the dose no longer makes the poison with these chemicals. There are no safe doses of exposure to EDCs. And it's thought that the timing of exposure is more important than the dose, especially to the fetus. So from cradle to grave no longer applies. It's now, we need to be looking at from conception to grave. Potency matters in relation to endocrine disruptors. So high dose experiments don't predict low dose impacts. And also we need to be mindful of the cocktail effect of these chemicals. They don't act in isolation, although they can do that as well. They bioaccumulate, they build up in the body, and they also have transgenerational effects. So we know this from mothers who were given the drug DES during pregnancy for morning sickness. And again, these chemicals are found in everything from personal care products to furniture, paint, firefighting foam, cooking utensils, food wrapping, toys, etc. And they're obviously found in the workplace and very pervasive in the environment as well. And more recently, pathways have been identified that shows endocrine disrupting chemicals as contributors towards COVID-19 severity. So thereby highlighting possible links between exposure to these environmental chemicals and disease development. But endocrine disruptors are also linked with breast cancer, and they can interfere with our levels of estrogen in the body. And we know that the greater the level of estrogen, the greater the risk of breast cancer. So we can conclude from this is if we can prevent exposure to chemicals linked to breast cancer causation, then breast cancer is a preventable disease, and it is a disease of our environments. So it's a disease of our living environment, our working environment, and the wider environment, and our first environment as well, the womb. And the current risk factors only account for some 30 to 50% of cases, leaving the other 50 to 70% with no known cause. But we know that breast cancer has strong link to certain chemicals and to work practices like night shift work, and also has strong links to certain occupations and workplaces which have a very high rates of very specific cancers. We know that cancer is also caused by social and economic factors such as poor housing, poor environments, poor air quality, and poor working conditions. And we also know that cancer is caused by a lack of political will to do anything about it. So we have it's a social justice and human rights issue. And also breast cancer is an indicator of the state of the environment, all environments. And we know as well that other diseases and health impacts and illnesses have been linked to exposure to EDCs and other toxic chemicals. So eliminating or reducing exposure would have a beneficial effect on the health overall. There's been a global rise in the rate of non-communicable diseases, such as like low sperm quality, genital malformation, preterm birth, low birth weight, endocrine related cancers, and early onset of breast development in young girls, early onset puberty, and also diseases like type 2 diabetes. But most importantly, these trends occur in a time frame which is inconsistent with the much slower pace of changes in the human genome. So indicating that our environment has shaped these disease patterns. Now, this is a slide from the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. They've produced a really interesting report looking at a new cancer plan for California. This slide looks at the issue of breast cancer as a multifactorial disease, which is linked to many factors which influence each other. So we can see that factors like race or ethnicity are linked with age of menarche. Breast density are linked with things like HRT, and also they're linked with external hormones such as endocrine disruptor, age, and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex disease, breast cancer. But we have to answer the question, given its multifactorial nature, why the cancer establishment has only focused on lifestyle risk factors for the last 50 years. Because even these risk factors are linked to our environment and occupations, our diet, and so things like diet and alcohol can contain traces of pesticides. Maybe food is wrapped or contained in packaging containing endocrine disruptors, which are linked to breast cancer, or exercising can expose us to air pollution, which is linked to denser breasts. Women living in cities have been found to have denser breasts, which is linked to breast cancer. Occupational risk factors are linked to a multiplicity of other factors, which also influence our risk. Yet few, if any, cancer plans address occupational risk factors for breast cancer or environmental risk factors either. And also we know that women face triple jeopardy with exposures in the home, in the workplace, and then again in the wider environment. So we see from this side cancer and their work causes, that breast cancer has been linked to ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, to endocrine disruptors, to solvents, smoke, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, dioxins, and also long-term work at night. But what is of concern is that when it comes to pregnancy, occupational cancer exposure can happen in the womb before current health and safety measures are implemented. So therefore, in the first 3 months of pregnancy. And therefore, these exposures could be setting the fetus up for illness and disease later in life, including breast and other cancer, if there is no protection for the mother in these vital 3 months. And researchers have identified about 216 different chemicals that cause mammary tumors in animals. And about half these chemicals women are exposed to in their daily life. So we must question really how ethical it is to intentionally expose pregnant women and children to synthetic chemicals known to be hazardous in animal studies. And I think it's time really that we put the public back in public health and start from the premise that safe and healthy working conditions are a human right. And also the Breast Cancer Fund uncovered elevated breast cancer risk for working women in about 20 occupations, which were associated with considerable risk of breast cancer compared to the risk for the general population. And 5 types of jobs with elevated risk for cancer include nurses, with up to 50% higher risk than the general population. Teachers have double the risk, librarians, lawyers, and journalists, and other professions have up to 4 times the risk, radiological technicians up to double the risk, lab technicians, factory workers, and those working with chemical solvents up to 3 times the risk. And yet more studies found that women working in jobs for 10 years where they were exposed to high levels of chemicals that were identified either as mammary carcinogens or endocrine disruptors increased their risk of breast cancer by 42%. Yet more studies found that women working with in the automotive plastics industry increased their risk of breast cancer by 400%. And those working in food canning, possibly because these cans are lined with bisphenol A, increased their risk by up to 500%. And more studies found women working as flight attendants and science technicians all had elevated risk of breast cancer. So again, we ask, why aren't occupational risk factors addressed in any cancer plan or strategy? And we know that pesticides also are linked to breast cancer, and this is of particular relevance to Latin America, as the use of pesticides in agricultural activities has increased significantly during the last decades. And several studies have reported the health damage resulting from exposure to pesticides in Mexico and Latin America. Thousands of communities depend economically on agricultural activities. And in Argentina, the total pesticide use has risen by 90% between 1997 and 2011. And the use of herbicides, including glyphosate, which is classified as a probable carcinogen, rose by 185% during that time. And in Yucatan, the high rates of breast and cervical cancer mortality are linked with the high levels of organic chlorine pesticides, which contaminate the water there. And many older and banned pesticides have been detected in the blood and breast milk of Mayan women. Also in Argentina, researchers have detected traces of glyphosate in 85% of personal care products and gauze and menstrual products, and which contain cotton. And these were purchased in supermarkets or drugstores. And this is thought to have resulted from the spraying contamination of the cotton. And obviously you do not want chemicals like glyphosate in products like menstrual products, which are using in very intimate places and very absorbent places of women's bodies. And research also revealed that traces of herbicide and insecticide were detected in the blood of 80% of children from it. I'm sorry about my pronunciation for this, Ituzango area. And data also showed that the cancer cases have jumped there by 50% to 300 from 2001 to 2009, which is an incidence rate of 41 times the national average. In Santa Fe, cancer rates were documented at 2 to 4 times higher than the national average, along with the sharply increasing rates of miscarriage there as well. And in Chaco, regional birth reports showed a quadrupling of congenital defects from 19.1 to 85.3 in a decade after GMO crops and glyphosate took hold in Argentina. And a very inspiring woman, Sofia Gatica, who was the mother, unfortunately, of of an infant who died as a result of pesticide poisoning, organized women locally to stop the indiscriminate spraying of toxic agrochemicals in the neighboring soya fields. And the mothers of Ituzango, they filed multiple complaints with local leaders. They protested the corporate influence in what the group called the poisoning of their towns, population of 5,000 residents. And we know that Argentina is the world's third largest exporter of soybeans. And every year the industry sprays about 50 million gallons of agrotoxins through aerial spraying over farmland. And this can be glyphosate, which is a key ingredient in Monsanto's widely used herbicide Roundup, and also pesticides like endosulfan, which is banned in 80 countries because of its effects on human health. And but we know that most of the occupational and chemical risk assessment has been carried out on men and then extrapolated to women. And despite the fact that women are particularly affected by these chemicals because we have a lifetime of hormonal changes, puberty, pregnancy, menopause, menstruation. We have different immune systems, so we're more prone to immune disease, autoimmune disease. So women make up about 80% of those affected. We have thinner skin, which may allow for greater absorbency of these chemicals. We detox more slowly. We have more fat tissue, which may allow the storage of more fat-soluble toxic chemicals. And we're affected differently by chemicals and pollution. For example, this denser breast tissue found in women living in cities. We're also smaller than men. So sex differences are found in almost every system of the body. And on top of this, women are also more likely to be in poorly paid, less well-regulated work, maybe working from home for themselves and family businesses, or and are more likely to be affected by things like night shift work as well. So this triple jeopardy exposure. And also if you are a Black or ethnic minority woman, the outcomes are far worse, because the exposure to hazards increases the lower you go down the social class ladder. And racial inequalities and the associated job segregations means that Black, Latino, ethnic minority workers are far more likely to be working in very much more dirty, difficult and dangerous jobs with the associated risk to their occupational health. And I think it's very important when we're doing this work as well, when I'm doing this work, that there are lives behind every statistic. We kind of talk about these statistics, but you know, in reality, the huge number of cases that of breast cancer around the world, it's the most common cancer in women worldwide, with over 2 million cases and 627,000 deaths. And in Mexico, that amounts to 27,283 cases and 6,884 deaths. And the trend in Latin America and the Caribbean for breast cancer mortality rate, especially in the years 1990 to 2015, the risk of dying as a result of breast cancer is double in Latin America than it is in the USA. And in the USA, the rates went from 1 in 29 women born between 1888 and 1892 to 1 in 10 for women born between 1948 and 1952. So that's a doubling of cases over 50 years. This may be in line with the increased use of endocrine disruptors, as highlighted in Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which was published in 1962. And we also know that Black women have worse outcomes for breast cancer, especially in terms of mortality rates. And in the USA, younger Black women can develop a more aggressive form of breast cancer with a higher mortality rate. And in the UK, the disease tends to be more advanced on presentation. I'm not sure why this is happening. Yes, each October, which is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, despite these growing numbers, we are treated to this festival of pink. And you can get pink cars, pink motorbikes, pink disposable cups, teddy bears, stun guns, cranes, fracking drill bits, crutches, football gear, Scrabble, golf balls, and also bullets and guns. It's really from the sublime to the ridiculous. And companies are falling over themselves trying to produce these pink products aimed to raise money for breast cancer. And this is called pink washing. Ironically, many of these pink products are sold containing ingredients or are manufactured from chemicals linked to breast cancer, such as ingredients in plastics or petrochemicals in cars or contaminated fracking fluids. And in reality, the sums raised for breast cancer are minuscule, and it's actually doing nothing to stem the rising cases of the disease. And we need to be focusing on following the money here and questioning how much is raised and how it is spent. I'd just like to take a minute out there. I can't see you all at the moment, but I hope you're all still awake and there. I don't know if you want to actually give yourself a bit of a stretch, because it's quite hard sitting in a chair focusing on something like this for 40 minutes. So maybe you could all kind of reach for the stars for a minute, track the sun's process across the sky, maybe bend down and touch the grass beneath your feet, embrace the universe, and then give yourselves a pat on the head and a rub on the belly, and we'll carry on then. So hopefully a nice big stretch. And I hope I'm not going too fast for the translator. I can't actually see that either, but I hope it's all right. In 2011, the World Health Organization acknowledged the environmental and occupational risk factors for cancer. And if you look very closely at this picture, you'll see me standing there as well. I was at that conference, and it was really felt like something was shifting. It was fairly groundbreaking. They released a statement called the Asturias Declaration, where they said primary prevention of exposures that cause cancer, is the single most effective means of prevention. And they went on to state that prevention of environmental and occupational exposures that cause cancer must be an integral component of cancer control worldwide. Yet, few, if any, cancer plans acknowledge the environmental and occupational risk factors. And I understand that Brazil and Mexico recognize breast cancer as a public health priority, but I wasn't able to follow all the links to find policies or any cancer plans or strategies. But maybe it might be worth looking at the breast cancer prevention partners Californian plan, which looks at the cancer risk factors contributing to all cancers and other chronic diseases. It also works with communities to look at lowering the rate of breast cancer, which will also be beneficial to other health impacts as well, because in this report they concluded that breast cancer prevention can serve as a bellwether for community health. So it's something worth looking at as well, because it outlines a cancer plan that will really address the missing risk factors of occupational environmental risk factors. In the European Union, they've produced a report, Chemicals for Sustainability. They introduced the concept of essential use, which will look at limiting the hazardous ingredients in products, and they promise a more legally binding identification of hazardous chemicals and banning of endocrine disrupting chemicals from consumer products, which would be really revolutionary. They also allow for the chemical cocktail risk when assessing risks for chemicals, and crucially, they acknowledge that strengthening the information on carcinogens plays a fundamental role in the fight against cancer. And we see there are multiple organizations and agencies and decades of research which have looked at this issue. The report from the Interagency Breast Cancer Environmental Research Committee said we urgently need to accelerate progress towards understanding the role of the environment in breast cancer prevention. And they said it must be considered in primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. The World Health Organization said that endocrine disruptors that have the capacity to interfere with tissue and organ development and function, and therefore they may alter susceptibility to different types of diseases throughout life. And they consider this a global threat. The American Public Health Association said that we must focus on eliminating work-related and environmental carcinogen, and this needs more attention, more funding, more political work, more regulation and more workplace action. And also the President's Cancer Panel in 2009 in the USA said that the burden of environmentally induced cancer has been grossly underestimated, and a precautionary preventive orientation report should replace current reactionary approaches to environmental contaminants. And the Endocrine Society said that determining how much evidence is enough, because this is the continual feedback we get from the cancer establishment that there is never enough evidence to actually act. The Endocrine Society said that determining how much evidence is enough is based on rigorous peer-reviewed science, and keeping in mind that absolute proof of harm or proof of safety is never really possible, and we know this in all science. So why we think that a paper, sorry, I just get some water. So a research paper has been written. I thought this was by Ellen McSweeney, and thought this was a really good quote from it. She said that obstetricians and gynecologists are uniquely positioned to have direct interaction with women as they are making decisions about their fertility. and the shift in professional guidelines to highlight the role of obstetricians and gynecologists in advising women about concerns related to exposure to endocrine disruptors is surely grounded with a recognition of the harms associated with exposure and with an intention of protecting women and their children from detrimental health outcomes. And she considered this a positive direction that some professional organisations have begun to realise and acknowledge that the risks are outside the control of individual women. And they are starting to call for a broader change at policy level. And it is an effort that obstetricians, gynecologists and their professional organisations should continue to engage with in order to protect their patients. And also another very important stakeholders are women in this. We need to include women as important stakeholders, and we can see this from the work of Sofia Gatica and the mothers of Itsuzango. And also, hopefully Jane MacArthur is on this call. She's doing a very important piece of research in a toll bridge in Canada where there was a cluster of breast cancer. And her work emphasises the importance of including women as partners and collaborators in public health and breast cancer prevention strategies. And she said that women are important knowledge producers and interpreters and should be included as partners and collaborators in public health and breast cancer prevention strategies. So we need to move the story of environmental breast cancer from the margins of awareness into the open spaces and fill in the gaps on breast cancer by making critical interventions at all systems levels. So what's needed? What do we need to do? Well, quite a lot. But what we need to be doing is lay the groundwork and feed the soil, so to speak, to make this prevention happen. So there needs to be a three-pronged approach. So rather like a Mexican work stool, we need equal footing, equal action and equal funding for treatment and care, safer detection and primary prevention. We need to have a really good aim of zero occupational and environmental cancer. We need a complete update of existing cancer plans and strategies, so updated for the 21st century to deal with 21st century risk factors. And in order to make this happen, we need to increase the spending on research into primary prevention, which is currently under 5%. So we need to increase this to at least 35%. And medical establishments can lead the way by providing up-to-date training on recognizing these occupational and environmental illnesses, and also diseases like pesticide resulting from pesticide exposure, pesticide poisonings, especially in areas where exposure is most likely. And very importantly, all this research data must be collected and broken down by sex, because it's very hard to deduce something if you don't have the proper data broken down by sex. And prevention of exposure to environmental chemicals is really a priority for reproductive health professionals everywhere. We need to be putting the public back into public health and start from the premise that safe and healthy working conditions and a safe and healthy environment are a human right for all. So these are my contact details if anyone wants to follow up later, and also a link to the brochure that started this all from Women in Europe for a Common Future. It's available in several different languages. And also information about their project Nesting or Nesbau. So Women Engage for a Common Future have lots and lots of publications on their website, which look at numerous things around toxic chemicals and pregnancy, toxic chemicals when you're building your nest, so toxic chemicals in furniture or paint, in personal care products for mother and baby, and also toxic chemicals in things like toys. And the link should be, the links for all the information I presented should be at the end of my slides. So thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Lynn. Añadiendo un poco más sobre esta lámina. En esta página pueden bajar algunos de los brochures y folletos que están ahí, que están en español. Pueden distribuirlos, pueden hacer el uso que necesiten de ellos. Es información muy, muy valiosa y toda esta información tiene que ver con sustancias químicas en relación a daños a la salud. Aquí están también los contactos de Helen. Y quisimos, a propósito, hacer este webinar un poco más largo de lo común para abrir para preguntas y respuestas. Estamos esperando sus preguntas. Ya tenemos algunas en el chat. Fernando de IPEN nos va a hacer el favor de hacerlas para que Helen pueda contestarlas. Adelante, Fernando.
Sí, también si podrían dejar de compartir pantalla para...
Sorry. Okay. Okay, one sec.
Sí, bueno, en primer lugar, dar las gracias a Helen, a nombre de IPEN, de la Red Internacional de Eliminación de Contaminantes, miembros de Women for a Common Future son miembros de IPEN. IPEN le interesa especialmente el tema de perturbación endócrina y precisamente la contaminación ambiental. Agradecemos la participación de Helen y de Sofía Chávez de Casa por organizar este webinar. Para pasar a las preguntas, uno de los participantes, Fabián Carballo, pregunta por qué, por ejemplo, los maestros tienen una mayor incidencia de cáncer como ocupacional. O también decían abogados, ¿alguna idea por qué tipo de riesgos químicos están expuestos? Esa es la primera pregunta.
It may not be chemical substances, or it may be chemical substances in combination with other things. And I think, yes, that's a good question. The paper didn't conclude as to why this was happening, but we think that it's to do with occupational and environmental exposures. If anyone knows more about this, please raise your hand to answer. But I think it's just highlighting the fact that there's high rates of cancer in certain professions, and we don't know why they're happening. And this is why we need more research into this, more funding to find out, what's going on. I mean, with some professions like laboratory technicians, obviously exposed to chemicals, but it's harder to know why teachers would have higher rates of breast cancer.
Sí, la otra pregunta, con todos estos múltiples factores de riesgo que favorecen el cáncer de mama, ¿cuál es el factor que dispara la apariencia del desarrollo de la enfermedad? Trigger the appearance of the disease. O sea, ¿de cuál de ellos? ¿Cuál es la identificación del mecanismo que trigger, que dispara la enfermedad?
You mean, sorry, which factor?
Yes.
Which factor? Well, I mean, for me, it's exposure to endocrine disruptors. Because we're exposed to so many in, like I say, in multiple environments. It's this cumulative exposure, and also we're exposed pre-birth as well, which is very important route of exposure, which may set us up for disease in later life. So I think we really need to start looking and regulating endocrine disruptors. We're only just sort of devising mechanisms where we can identify them in the EU. They're putting together legislations to do that. We know we've been living with this chemical since 1962. So for me, it really is endocrine receptors for starters. That's where I would start looking at decreasing exposures.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta. ¿Hay datos de cáncer de mama transgeneracional por exposición en útero?
The transgenerational, well, we know a lot from, it was a drug called DES. That's the short name. It was given to pregnant women for morning sickness. And we know that sons and daughters had various different health effects, and their sons and daughters also had various different health effects as a result of the mother's exposure to DES. And I'll have to probably send the link to the paper on that to say, but there was health effects such as cancers, breast cancer, testicular cancer, and yeah, but we know from possibly other exposures as well that there's these transgenerational effects from exposure to endocrine receptors.
Sí, bueno, hay comentarios que dicen que es una enfermedad multifactorial. Hay comentarios que dicen que es una enfermedad multifactorial, que hay muchas. Otra pregunta es, ¿cuál es la contribución de tejido adiposo al desarrollo de cáncer de mama?
You mean the fat tissue?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The fat tissue. Well, these chemicals build up in our fat tissue. That's where they're stored in the body. They're bioaccumulative. They also build up in the fat tissue of animals and in animals and the food we eat. They build up in the fat in things like dairy products. So we're kind of adding to our exposure all the time. And also they're passed on through breast milk from mother to child, unwittingly, I must say. So that's why the adipose tissue is important, and women have more fat tissue than men, so greater storage of these chemicals. And they concentrate up the food chain as well. And top of the food chain is the human infant. So they bioaccumulate in various different animals and things we eat and things we're exposed to. But the human infant is the top of the food chain. Is that understandable? Sorry.
Hay otra pregunta. ¿Es posible que alguno de los contaminantes atmosféricos llegue directamente a la mama? ¿Podría ser por absorción o directamente por la vía respiratoria?
Sorry, just say that again.
Sí, creo que Fernando no se puede escuchar. La pregunta es si es posible que alguno de los contaminantes atmosféricos llegue directamente a la mama. Podría ser por absorción o directamente por la vía respiratoria.
Yeah, possible through our air pathways, through the skin, and through ingestion as well. Depending on the chemical, obviously not all chemicals are absorbed or breathed in. There's been detectable levels of certain chemicals found in breast tissue. That's how we know they get there. And actually, I didn't put that in the slides, but that's how we know they're building up in the body. They've been found in breast milk, but they've also been found in fat tissue and breast tissue as well.
Sí. Bueno, hay muchas felicitaciones. Recordarles a los que preguntan, la presentación va a ser compartida igual que la grabación. Un comentario, en México, yo diría que también en América Latina, son mínimos los programas de prevención del cáncer. Son mínimos los programas de prevención del cáncer de mama y la mayor parte de los programas se enfoca a la detección. Entonces, yo diría que si hay ejemplos de programas que estén enfocados a la prevención, programas gubernamentales o programas de estados particulares, de provincias, que usted conozca, que pueden servir como ejemplo de lo que se puede usar como política pública en Europa, en Estados Unidos o en otro país.
There are that new report I was talking about from Breast Cancer Prevention Partners really sets out a primary prevention cancer plan for California that can be replicated. So that's worth taking a look at. Malta has a very good cancer prevention policy as well, strategy. France addresses occupational risk factors in their cancer strategy. I mean, I suppose, you know, there are good examples. Actually, I didn't put that on the side. There are good examples, but they're only as good as the political will to actually implement them, or the cancer establishment's willingness to actually acknowledge them. And this is where we come up against the barriers all the time, is the cancer establishments and the medical establishments' willingness to actually act on this. So 50 years, they've just been concentrating on these lifestyle risk factors, but not on these occupational risk factors or environmental risk factors. And they keep saying there's not enough evidence, give more evidence, and we give more evidence, but it's never enough. So it's very hard to know how to get over around that barrier. I mean, when things are actually put into the cancer plans, then at least you can kind of point to them and say, you know, you should be doing this. This is what you should be working on. So yeah, so I take a look at the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners plan, the French plan, and the Maltese plan. And Finland has done something good as well. But again, if I can't answer your questions now, I'm quite happy to email later with information to do that. Yeah.
Sí,
if anybody
gracias.
else knows of any other ones, please tell me.
Sí, gracias. Hay otra pregunta.
Fernando, antes de continuar, me gustaría hacer una petición. Pilar comenta que quedó muy poco tiempo en la pantalla de las webs de referencia. Si nos pudiera hacer favor, Helen, de poner su pantalla en esa parte de la presentación y dejarla puesta para que las personas puedan tomar nota. Disculpen. Adelante, Fernando.
Bueno, Helen, la pregunta es si hay estudios acerca del incremento de cáncer en las áreas cercanas a incineradores de desechos. La pregunta es una persona de Eslovaquia donde hay planes para construir 5 más incineradores. Incineradores de desechos también, si también esto se relaciona con cementeras que queman desechos. Que queman desechos. Como factor de riesgo para el incremento de cáncer de mama.
I mean, for the waste incinerators, yeah, there's a link between dioxin exposure from incinerators and breast cancer. I haven't looked a lot at this. I don't know if anybody else on the call has, and I don't know about cement manufacturing places either, but definitely waste incinerators. And again, that might be something I could follow up later and send you some information. Unless anybody else has information, I'm sure IPEN's done quite a lot of work on this.
A ver, hay otra pregunta. ¿Qué papel
Sorry.
juegan las mamografías sistemáticas en mujeres sanas en cuanto a exposición a radiación? O sea, la exposición de radiaciones por las mamografías regulares sistemáticamente en mujeres sanas.
I don't think I would ever tell anyone not to have a mammogram. I think you need to inform yourself very well. I think as a detection tool, it's not the best. I think we could do better. I think we could have a lot safer detection methods. It has been said that mammography could cause a lot more cancers than it detects. But at the moment, it's the best detection tool we have. So I think, yeah, the thing to do is inform yourself and make a decision yourself about mammography. I would never tell anyone not to or to have one.
Sí, bueno, ya revisaban preguntas y respuestas y el chat no ve otra nueva pregunta.
Por aquí hay otra pregunta. Hugo Sierra pregunta lo que ya se había preguntado antes de la correlación entre el incremento de obesidad en la población y la aparición del cáncer. Esto debido a que la mayoría de las sustancias cancerígenas se acumulan en la grasa humana. Y creo que ya se respondió un poco esta pregunta. No sé si, Helen, quieres hablar un poco más al respecto.
All right. Again, it is linked with exposure to estrogen. And it's quite a complex relationship, I think, because we know that there are certain chemicals called obesogens, which are linked with obesity, and obesity is linked with cancer. But the emphasis has been on our diet and the fact that we're maybe eating too much fatty foods, and we should stop doing this. Which, yes, we should, but also nobody's looking at the chemicals in our environment which are used to wrap our food, and our tin cans where our food is contained, which have chemicals that are linked to obesity. So again, I think this needs to be unpicked a bit, because it's kind of in effect, it's kind of victim blaming, it's patient blaming. It's saying that you eat the wrong foods, you don't have enough exercise, you had your children too late, and so on and so forth. And we need to sort of move away from this this focus of on the breast cancer strategy, move away from these so-called lifestyle risk factors to look at the other risk factors, the other 50%, 50 to 70% of cases which aren't linked. So yeah, it's linked to the chemicals in the environment, I think, as much as to the diet and what we're eating.
And there's other question. Hay otra pregunta. Si ¿tiene alguna experiencia, Helen, en algún programa de colaboración que tenga la institución donde está trabajando y alguna institución o grupo en América Latina? ¿O grupo?
Not that I'm aware of. No. A long time ago, I used to be in contact with the Latin American Women's Organization a lot. I actually tried to find them online before the webinar, but I couldn't find them. I'm not sure. They did a lot of stuff on women's health. But no, there's no collaboration, no.
Yo quisiera hacer una pregunta como panelista. Después de todo el trabajo de incidencia, tanto como el público en general, como instituciones a nivel nacional e internacional, desde el Reino Unido, ¿cuál ha sido la experiencia en todos estos años de trabajo? ¿Ha habido una respuesta al trabajo de incidencia que has hecho, Helen?
Very, very, it's been very slow. I've been doing it for 25 years, and there's been very little movement. Really, I think, like I say, that's why I show the slides of all the different reports and all the different organizations which sort of back up this premise. And still we're fighting for the cancer establishment to actually recognize that chemicals are linked, chemical exposure are linked to breast cancer and other health effects as well. I think it's been quite slow, but then you get these reports from RCOG and FIGO that are actually acknowledging that this link, which is really good, and very reaffirming, to know that there's these organizations which are sort of thinking along these lines as well. I just want to, sorry, because I think Jane MacArthur might have an answer to one of the questions. Would you like to let her answer as well?
Sí, ¿podemos abrir el micrófono para Jane, por favor, Luis, para que pueda hablar?
Sí, ¿me repites para quién, por favor?
Jane MacArthur.
Hello.
Hola, Jane.
Can you hear me?
Sí, perfecto. Adelante.
Okay. Yes, I put in the chat just to reinforce what Helen was saying about the important role that scientists now think about obesogens, a category of chemical within the acknowledged endocrine disrupting chemicals that they think contribute to obesity. And I think it's an important distinction that needs to be made instead of, again, blaming women for somehow contributing to their breast cancer risk through the food they eat, but yet unwillingly ingesting and being exposed to obesogens, in other words, chemicals that are making them fatter or obese. And so we know that these are present in, as Helen said, food packaging and other environments. And if we continue to shift the focus away from the sources of those fat-causing chemicals and put the onus on women, then we can't push for those primary prevention activities that are needed. So I was just saying in the chat to reinforce and support what Helen was bringing up. And I think it's a really important issue. And I think here in Canada, it's my understanding that the advocates and scientists, environmental health experts are working for revisions to that act that would include the role of obesogens in health and as far as risk for breast cancer. And I think other places obviously need to follow suit as the science emerges to reinforce this evidence about that role, that it's an area we do need to focus on in those efforts.
Quisiera tomar el micrófono un minuto y hacer una pregunta, comentario. Cuando estábamos haciendo un poco de investigación como antecedente para este webinar, encontramos que en las páginas oficiales de organizaciones de salud internacionales se toca muy poco el tema que relaciona a las sustancias químicas con cáncer de mama. Y tocando el tema también de las sustancias que causan la obesidad en las personas, y no hablando de grasa ni de carbohidratos, sino sustancias que causan obesidad como tal, sustancias químicas perturbadoras que causan obesidad. Me pregunto si el que las organizaciones internacionales de salud no hablen de la relación entre sustancias químicas y cáncer de mama, a pesar de tener tanta conocimiento en el tema, aunque hace falta más, pero ya hay conocimiento en el tema, que tenga que ver con una cuestión de incidencia de la industria química para que no se hable al respecto? Y la pregunta es abierta tanto para Jane como para Helen.
I mean, I think from my perspective, there's a lot of vested interests in this. I mean, this whole obesogen science, I say, is relatively new. And if they're not acknowledging the fact that chemicals like endocrine disruptors are linked with breast cancer, then the whole thing about obesogens is a whole other other issue. I mean, we've been to see some of the breast cancer organizations in the UK, and we say, you know, well, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Environmental Protection Organization, or the UNEP, and all these other organizations are saying that there's these links. Why won't you? And like say, we come up against these barriers, and we're not sure why. I mean, vested interests definitely play a part, but it's very hard when you start looking into who's funding who and who has got links with what. It's very hard to kind of unearth all these things. And it is like, I think somebody says, like the tobacco industry years ago, you know, everyone's got links to everything else, or asbestos. If you're working on asbestos, you know, there's so many vested interests and stuff. But you know, I think what it comes down to is it only takes one organization to start to lift their head above the parapet. We thought that was going to happen with the president's cancer panel report, and that was whatever year it was, 2009. But it hasn't, I don't think it's translated really to policy on this. It's also got to do with the fact that health professionals and the medical establishment don't get this kind of training. They don't get this kind of training, or they don't get much training on chemical exposures. So, you know, and there's very little research money out there as well to fund this kind of research, you know. And you know, I think we can learn a lot from what's happened with COVID. We've seen when the money's there, when the will is there, and when the researchers and the organizations and the academics, everybody is there, then things can happen and progress really, really quickly. And that's why I said I think this needs to happen with cancer now, from what we've learned, what we learn all the time about COVID. Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer, but...
Sí, hay otro comentario. Dice, aquí la pregunta que hacemos es ¿qué pueden hacer las sociedades, la sociedad civil, para poner al descubierto y frenar estas actividades por parte de la industria? Y lo mismo ocurrió con el cambio climático y el problema de los hidrocarburos.
Do you want to say anything, Jane, about this?
Well, that's a really big question.
That's why I asked you if you want to say anything about it.
Well, I think it's the question that many of us are always asking, and I think, you know, I don't think I could answer it any better than Helen or anyone else, but I do have, you know, my ideas based on my experience and you know, my area of research. I think it's a broader question about the kind of you know, values that we have, the values that our governments are operating on. It's about as Helen said earlier, the influence, who's funding what research, who's funding and you know, lobbying for certain policies and, you know, certain kinds of legislation to be in existence. What I think it takes from civil society is it's a multi-step process. It's a process of social change, of first understanding you know, the evidence, the research that's out there. And I think, you know, we need to push at our own local levels to have greater funding, as Helen said, again, that three-pronged approach. We need to come at it from the perspective of improving treatments and detection and primary prevention. So the funding just has not been there for not only trying to study and understand the links between exposures and breast cancer, and then to shifting the kind of practices and policies in workplaces and general environments. So I think we can take cues from the youth climate change movement, for example. I think we need to be coming together and repeating the same messages over and over, that public health has to be a priority and not profit. Unfortunately, many of our governments are operating in the opposite way. So I think it's going to take collective efforts, and it's going to take local action and action at the level of you know, governments, national governments, and globally as well. So I don't think there's a simple answer to it, but I think it has to do with our values. And I know we talk a lot about neoliberalism, which puts the responsibility on the individual for their health, but that framing ignores that humans and their health exist in a nested set of relationships. Individuals live in families, in communities, and they work in workplaces that are regulated by, you know, local governments, and we can't ignore that all of those things interact to contribute to health. So I think the strategy at the civic level is there's a number of ways we can intervene.
Muchas gracias, Jane. Helen, una pregunta más para Jane y Helen. Si saben ustedes casos de juicios, mujeres afectadas por cáncer de mama que hayan hecho herramientas de defensa legal contra alguna empresa o algún agente, así como hubo este jardinero que demandó a Monsanto por el linfoma. ¿Conocen ustedes casos de mujeres afectadas por cáncer de mama que hayan hecho estas herramientas legales?
I know that in Denmark, women with breast cancer got compensated because of being exposed to night shift work. I'm not sure that was a trial at a company, but the government gave them compensation because they developed breast cancer as a result of working night shifts. So that sets a sort of legal precedence. I know that here in Scotland, there has been a long-running campaign, and I'm not sure where it's up to now, but women who worked in the microelectronics industry in a factory in Greenock, very high rates of breast cancer, and they have been campaigning for an awful long time. And I'm not sure, I'll have to follow this up as well. I'm not sure where they've got to now, but if there's any other cases, I'm not aware of them, that somebody has proved that, because I know that colleagues in Canada have been looking at taking a case against an employer who where somebody had links got breast cancer and they were linking it with the work they were doing, but that the case didn't succeed. I suppose, again, sorry, Jane, because Jane was looking at rates of breast cancer on a toll bridge in Canada, but I don't think that they actually took the employer to court to look at the links between the work they were doing and what they were exposed to, the pollution they were exposed to in the workplace.
So there was an attempt to get compensation for a woman who worked at the bridge in Canada, and that failed. And if I understand it correctly, here in Canada, in terms of the legal system, the compensation system, which is in place in order to to give, let's just say straightforward, give money if there's been a workplace exposure, I think that system protects the employers from being sued outside of the compensation system. So in terms of workplace exposure, I don't think that there have been any lawsuits against companies because they would be operating under a different legal framework. But I don't know from a civic perspective. I'm thinking, for example, I know that Johnson & Johnson with the talc exposure and ovarian cancer, but I don't know either whether or not there's been a successful lawsuit for exposure and development of breast cancer.
I would suggest go look at this site, the Hazards magazine here. It's got lots and lots of information about occupational health and safety, toxic chemicals, and also will have information. They have written quite a lot about this compensation and looking at cancer cases. So that might be a good resource to check up on.
Quisiera comentar algo para Helen y para Jane, específicamente para América Latina, donde pues este es un tema bastante desconocido y mucho menos abordado. Si pudieran dar su experiencia o sus comentarios de cómo podría hacerse un abordaje para poner este tema en la agenda pública. ¿Cuáles serían los elementos a abordar para traer este tema al conocimiento de la gente, de los médicos y de las instituciones de salud y a las instituciones que hacen la normatividad?
I can only say what we tried to do here to influence our government. We went and saw our MPs. We lobbied government. We actually organised a whole day of lobbying our legislators in government. So women, and it was mostly women, all women, that arranged to meet their MPs on a certain day and lobby them about breast cancer. We raised questions of the cancer charities, especially the breast cancer charities here. Like I said, with all the pink products, we organised information with a national trade union here, Unison, and we produced information for their members. They had over 1 million members, to actually ask questions about the pink products that the breast cancer organisations were selling in Breast Cancer Awareness Month to raise money for breast cancer, to ask questions about the products, to ask questions about how much money was raised, what it was spent on, and where it went. I think this was quite successful because now here in the UK, the breast cancer charities put on their website how much was raised, where it was spent on from all the money raised during October. I think for me, I kind of lost faith in the government here, so I did an awful lot of work in Europe when they were preparing the REACH legislation, which is on the chemicals regulation, and Europe used to govern the UK chemicals regulation, which they're probably not going to do anymore, unfortunately. But the REACH legislation was actually instigated by a woman. And what she did when she was preparing the paper, she had a big meeting of all the European Women's Organization to get their backing of the legislation and then put it forward. And it's world-class regulation. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's gold standards. It's the best there is. But I thought it was very clever of her to actually engage all the women's organizations in this. That's what we're trying to do here, because we don't know what kind of chemicals regulation we're going to get after we leave Europe. So now we're trying to look at getting together all the stakeholders, the women's organizations, the trade unions, the environmental organizations to write letters to the legislators about ensuring that the chemicals regulation here protects everybody, protects us from breast cancer and other cancers, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think it's to target the cancer organizations, the medical organizations, to raise questions where you can, but also lobby your legislators. And like I say, I wasn't able to find if there was it did say that Mexico and Brazil had good health policies and cancer prevention or cancer policies, but I couldn't see what it was actually looking at. So yeah, and I think there's quite a lot of, one of the cancer organizations, I think Sophia or Maria sent me a link, there was quite a lot of breast cancer organizations listed, and even the very small ones are good to go and talk to. I did lots of workshops and talks with various different support groups and cancer organizations about chemicals and breast cancer. So you really need to kind of build the groundswell, but it's hard. It takes a lot of work, especially if there's very few of you, you know, but to get the word out there really, because it's one thing to have organizations calling for this legislation and recognition of these risk factors, but it's quite another to have the public calling for you know, to back you up, because that's who the legislators listen to really.
Bueno, hay un comentario de un estudiante de medicina de la Universidad de Guadalajara que felicita por la conferencia. Dice que en su opinión todas las empresas siempre van a tener conflicto de interés por el dinero. Es muy difícil que cambien sus formas de producción y que es bueno hacer movimientos y organizaciones que busquen ese cambio, pero va a tomar mucho tiempo. Dentro de ese tiempo es nuestro trabajo como prestadores de servicios de salud, como investigadores, debemos brindar a la población esta información valiosa, porque a veces por comodidad seguimos comprando y consumiendo productos que son nocivos para la salud. Felicidades.
Básicamente estamos sobre el tiempo. Queremos pedirles a todos si por favor pueden abrir sus cámaras para tomar una imagen y verlos a todos. Un segundo les pedimos si pueden abrir todos sus cámaras para conocernos, aunque sea un segundo. Y estarnos viendo por ahí. Ya tenemos muchas cámaras abiertas. Bueno, pues gracias por abrirlas y por enseñarlos la intimidad de sus casas. Helen, Jane, muchísimas gracias. Creemos que esta es una conversación que apenas inicia para muchos de nuestros países y muchas de nuestras regiones. Estamos muy contentos de tenerlas acá, de poder compartir esta información y de pues empezar a hacer un trabajo de sensibilización en nuestras regiones o continuar haciéndolo quienes ya lo estamos haciendo. Agradecemos mucho la presencia de todos ustedes, agradecemos mucho la traducción, el trabajo de María Fernanda, Luis, Marisa, Fernando y Flor, quienes nos apoyan. Vamos a tener las grabaciones, tanto en español como en inglés, en la página de Casa para todos los que deseen retomar este webinar. También quedarán por ahí los datos de contacto de Helen, les pasamos también los datos de Jane, y si tienen alguna pregunta que haya quedado en el tintero, les agradecemos nos la hagan llegar y nosotros nos aseguraremos de hacerla extensiva para que tengan una respuesta. mucho entusiasmo es para los que continúan trabajando en estos temas. Es un camino arduo y difícil y largo, pero pues si no lo hacemos nosotros, ¿quién? Pues muchas gracias a los que están de este lado. Ahora sí, buenas tardes América y buenas noches Europa. Nos despedimos y seguiremos trabajando en futuros webinars y no perdemos el contacto. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Gracias.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Helen.
I hope it was all right. It was hard to know how fast or slow to speak. I hope it was okay.
It was perfect, and we'll be coming back to you for more help in the coming days. Have a Merry Christmas.
Yes, you too. You too.
Free of COVID.
Free of COVID, indeed. Free of lockdowns, yeah. All right.
Yes, we'll get back to you in January.
All right. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you,
Bye.
Helen.
Bye.